Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a time when personal hygiene was more of an optional suggestion than a daily routine, and the world of beauty was a delicate, dangerous, and occasionally lethal affair. So, get yourself comfortable, dim the lights, maybe pull a blanket up to your chin, and let's wander into fragrant, somewhat alarming world of ancient perfumes, makeup, and royal cosmetic excesses. Imagine, if you will, a royal court where the air was thick not just with gossip, but with a complex symphony of scents. People douse themselves in mixtures of musk, ambergris, and literally crushed animal parts, because, of course, nothing says sophistication like wearing a small zoo on your skin. The wealthy elite had a peculiar philosophy about odor. The more overpowering, the more refined. This wasn't exactly the subtlety of modern cologne, but in fairness, subtlety was rarely appreciated when one could announce one's arrival across the hall simply by floating in a cloud of civet-scented fog. Let's drift over to ancient Egypt first, where Cleopatra, famed for her charm and for supposedly bathing in milk, also had a fondness for extravagant perfumes. She commissioned scents made from flowers, herbs, and occasionally animal secretions. One might think this sounds innocuous, but the recipes could be volatile, and the fumes occasionally, well, disagreeable. Ancient records suggest that some mixtures were potent enough to make courtiers swoon, or, in less fortunate cases, develop mild poisoning symptoms. Still, Cleopatra persisted, because naturally, the queen's vanity outweighed any minor respiratory inconvenience. In Rome, perfumes were equally ambitious, though the approach leaned more toward the absurdly excessive. Wealthy Romans would carry tiny containers of scented oils, dabbed behind their ears, on their wrists, and sometimes even on the edges of their scrolls, in case anyone accidentally sniffed them while reading a letter. Imagine being a visitor, stepping into a room where the air is so thick with perfumes that one could almost see it. You would either marvel at the dedication to olfactory elegance or quietly wish for a small breeze to rescue you from the onslaught. Moving north, the European courts of the late Renaissance and early modern period had a somewhat different approach, though just as hazardous. Nobility bathed infrequently, often relying on copious amounts of scented powders and pomades to mask the less pleasant aspects of their daily existence. And by mask, I mean actively cover up, sometimes ineffectively, sometimes not so ineffectively, the fact that you haven't bathed in weeks. One particularly inventive French courtier created a face powder infused with lead, because why not? The idea, naturally, was to achieve a flawless, pale complexion. The reality, of course, leaned more toward early-onset toxicity. Speaking of toxicity, let's linger for a moment on the strange fascination with white skin that dominated Europe for centuries. The ideal was a face so pale that it practically glowed in dim candlelight, which was considered a mark of high status because, obviously, only those wealthy enough to avoid outdoor labor could maintain such a hue. To achieve this, queens, duchesses, and ambitious ladies of the court applied mixtures containing mercury and lead. These substances were admired for their cosmetic effect and discreetly admired for their slow, creeping damage to skin, teeth, and general health. Naturally, fashion trends rarely pause for concerns about fainting or gradual organ failure. One can imagine the subtle panic of a lady delicately checking her reflection in a polished metal plate, wondering if the mercury had yet started its work. Perfume, powder, and paint weren't only tools of vanity. They were instruments of social signaling. Wearing the wrong scent could mark you as socially inferior or, even worse, as someone lacking refinement. Courtiers who failed to comply could be gently, or not so gently, mocked. And so, a perfume mishap might be all it took to ruin a noble woman's day, which, in the grand scheme, seems like a relatively harmless disaster. Except, of course, that disasters in royal courts often involve public humiliation, feigning spells, and a certain amount of whispered plotting. Transitioning to personal hygiene, the history of bathing is a slow, somewhat tragic comedy. Even in times when public bathhouses were available, fear of disease, embarrassment, or simply the inconvenience of getting wet led many royals to adopt alternative strategies. Enter the powder puff, the scented sachet, and the elaborate wig, all of which helped mask odors. Wigs, in particular, were a marvel of engineering and mild olfactory offense. Powdered wigs in France and England could weigh several pounds and were often treated with perfume strong enough to qualify as chemical warfare by modern standards. One imagines a young page struggling to place the wig on his master's head, fully aware that the combination of body odor, animal-based powder, and perfume could induce fainting. Even the most fastidious royals had their moments of olfactory misfortune. Consider the story of a French king whose extravagant wigs and scented powders were so overwhelming that his courtiers required small fans and open windows just to survive an afternoon in his presence. This wasn't cruelty. It was survival. Perfume, after all, could be as oppressive as it was alluring. The line between sophistication and suffocation was thin, and royals walked it with the confidence of someone who had never experienced the fresh air of a mundane life. Let's drift onward to the social implications of these beauty practices. A noble woman's reputation could hinge on her appearance and scent. The tiniest lapse, sweat stains of faded powder or a faint whiff of unwashed hair, could invite judgment whispers or even cruel jokes. One can almost hear the quiet sighs as ladies pass one another in dimly lit corridors, subtly sniffing, subtly comparing, and subtly judging, all while maintaining composure expected of someone wearing 6 pounds of powdered wig and lead-based powder. Perfume and makeup were not without their dangers, and history records some rather unfortunate outcomes. Cases of mercury poisoning skin ulcers and fainting spells were surprisingly common, often dismissed as minor courtly inconveniences. It seems that the pursuit of beauty was considered worth every small disaster, because, naturally, vanity was non-negotiable in a royal context. Imagine the internal monologue of a duchess carefully applying a toxic mixture to her face while contemplating whether she might last the evening, without vomiting or collapsing. Spoiler alert, not always. And of course, the men were not immune. Noblemen doused themselves in perfume, powdered their hair, and applied scented oils to their bodies. The combination of overpowering fragrances and heavy wigs sometimes made court meetings hazardous, especially if one were prone to fainting or mild anxiety. Diplomats, tasked with negotiating treaties in rooms that smelled like a combination of musk, civet, and crushed flowers, may have found the whole experience profoundly unsettling. One wonders how much international diplomacy was influenced, not by logic or rhetoric, but by the sheer capacity to endure a 4-hour meeting in a cloud of animal-scented perfume. Tell me in the comments, would you survive a day in a court soaked in perfumes and powders, or would you quietly collapse into a fainting couch? As we drift gently through these scented corridors of history, it's worth noting the psychological effects. Smell has a peculiar power over memory and emotion, and in royal courts, where scents were deliberately manipulated, one could influence moods, perceptions, and even alliances. Imagine attending a courtly ball where every step, every bow, carried with the invisible weight of carefully crafted aroma. One misstep, and accidentally fainting from too much civet oil, could alter the course of a social evening, though rarely the course of history, thankfully. And so, as we ponder these fragrant follies, one cannot help but appreciate the dedication, ambition, and mild self-destruction involved in ancient beauty practices. These were people who risked fainting, poisoning, and social ridicule in pursuit of an ideal. Their lives were a delicate dance between elegance and olfactory catastrophe, a dance that modern viewers can observe from the safety of their beds, blankets tucked snugly around their ankles. Before we drift onward to explore the slightly more alarming world of royal childhoods and their dietary misadventures, take a moment to reflect. If you had the choice between wearing a wig so heavy it made you sway like a ship in a storm, or simply accepting the natural odors of your body, what would you have chosen? Let me know in the comments. It's always fascinating to imagine ourselves surviving, or failing to survive, the small horrors of ancient aristocratic life. Now that we've floated through the fragrant corridors of courtly perfume, let's drift gently toward another equally delicate topic, royal childhoods. Imagine, if you can, a nursery not of soft toys and storybooks, but of fragile nobles and over-ambitious caretakers, each with their own peculiar ideas of what constituted proper upbringing. Settle further into your pillow, perhaps wrap a light blanket around your shoulders, and let's wander slowly into the world where infant princes and princesses were both adored and quietly endangered. Royal children were rarely allowed to simply be children. Their lives were regimented, punctuated by carefully timed lessons, strict diets, and an endless series of examinations designed to prepare them for ruling kingdoms they could barely pronounce. Some were brilliant, Some were hopelessly spoiled, and most were simply alive against considerable odds. Infant mortality in the courts of Europe was astonishingly high, and while the royals loved their children in theory, there was always an undercurrent of fatalistic resignation. It wasn't uncommon for a monarch to sigh quietly and remark, with the faintest trace of boredom, "Of course one of them will succumb to some minor infection. That is life." Let's drift to England, where the Tudor dynasty produced a series of royals whose childhoods could only be described as fragile. Take, for example, Prince Edward, later Edward VI. His tutors, naturally, took education extremely seriously, which meant he spent hours on end memorizing Latin, French, and religious treatises, all while his frail body struggled under the weight of expectation. Illnesses were frequent. His court physicians, who were very earnest and very ineffective, prescribed mixtures of mercury, herbal concoctions, and what we might politely call medieval nonsense. And yet, he survived briefly, only to be followed by what seemed like a never-ending parade of poor health and slightly disastrous decisions, mostly made when he was barely older than the average high school freshman today. Over in France, the story was similar, though often more spectacularly dramatic. Royal children were expected to develop a taste for sophistication almost immediately after birth. Imagine a toddler in a silk frock, surrounded by scented powders, sugar-laden treats, and stern governesses who believed that crying was a character flaw rather than a natural reaction to being dressed in uncomfortable layers. Louis XIV, the Sun King, began his reign as a child, and though he eventually became a master of courtly control, his early years were filled with disease, insecurity, and the occasional royal tantrum that could echo through palace corridors. One can almost hear him huffing and stamping his tiny feet, while courtiers exchange quiet glances, silently hoping the next royal outburst doesn't involve the ceremonial crown. Nutrition, or the lack thereof, added a further layer of fragility. Royal diets were often paradoxically indulgent and catastrophic. Sweets were abundant, but fresh fruit and vegetables were inconsistently available, depending on season and supply. Children were encouraged to eat rich, often poorly preserved foods, which, combined with minimal exercise, meant that childhood illnesses spread like a slow, polite plague. Even a mild fever could be terrifying, and yet, in the grand tradition of royal stoicism, children were expected to smile through it, sometimes while being dressed in stiff collars and gowns that made breathing a mild struggle. We can't forget the bizarre customs surrounding weaning and early education. In many royal courts, children were separated from their mothers early, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of a belief in fostering independence, or, as some historians politely put it, encouraging the child to develop resilience. Of course, resilience in a 4-year-old who has just been pulled from the comforting presence of a nurse and placed with a stern tutor often looked more like crying, sneezing, and minor tantrums. Imagine a toddler quietly plotting revenge while being lectured on the importance of courtly manners. It's a picture both endearing and slightly tragic. Beyond nutrition and discipline, there were odd habits and eccentricities that seemed to crop up as a direct consequence of royal life. Children were often subjected to early exposure to political intrigue. They observed whispered conversations, secretive glances, and subtle power plays, all while still learning basic arithmetic. Some of them, naturally, internalized this with remarkable skill, later becoming brilliant strategists. Others, predictably, developed mild paranoia or an overinflated sense of their own importance, which is not necessarily a flaw in a monarch, but it does make for slightly uncomfortable tea parties. Perhaps the most endearing, yet ultimately perilous, aspect of royal childhoods was the use of early medicinal experiments. Physicians, convinced that they knew exactly how to fortify a young royal body, prescribed everything from bloodletting to herbal syrups, sometimes in quantities that would shock a modern parent. Teething? Mercury paste. Fever? Leech. Cough? A suspiciously potent mixture of wine and herbs that might make a small child stagger. Parents, usually anxious but politely deferential, allowed these procedures, because naturally, if the doctor said it was a good realm, who were they to argue? And then there were the accidents. Slips on polished floors, mishaps with candles, minor poisoning from incorrectly prepared meals. Each a gentle reminder that royalty did not confer immunity to the everyday dangers of life. The difference, of course, was that when royals suffered, The event was meticulously recorded, occasionally exaggerated, and then discussed for generations. Diaries, letters, and later memoirs provide a strangely comforting evidence of how relatable, in their vulnerability, these children were, despite their titles and fine gowns. One particularly curious example comes from Spain, where royal children were often confined in enormous nurseries designed to isolate them from infectious diseases. The rooms were large, decorated with tapestries, and staffed by a small army of nurses. In theory, this protected the young royals. In practice, it meant that the children spent long stretches without physical affection from their parents, attended only by wet nurses who were more interested in gossip than comfort. The resulting mixture of boredom, mild terror, and indulgence created personalities that oscillated between precocious brilliance and awkward social tension. Let's drift briefly to the Scandinavian courts, where cold winters and long nights added a further layer of complexity. Royal children were expected to endure not only strict educational routines, but also harsh physical conditions, because resilience was considered a virtue. Frostbite, rickets, and occasional outbreaks of scurvy were common. Courtiers would murmur politely about the poor little prince's delicate constitution, while simultaneously ensuring he remained dressed in multiple layers of wool and silk that made even basic mobility a mild challenge. One can almost see a small child tripping over the hems of his own garments, quietly muttering a wish for a normal life outside palace walls. Education itself was a mix of rigorous academics and peculiar hobbies. Young royals learned multiple languages, philosophy, and religious doctrine, alongside fencing, hunting, and music. The juxtaposition was jarring but strangely effective. A child could recite Latin poetry while simultaneously attempting to shoot a falcon, and perhaps, through sheer exhaustion, forget momentarily that life could be uncomfortable. Tutors, exhausted by the sheer weight of responsibility, often took solace in brief naps or whispered complaints to one another about the futility of it all. Royal children were also expected to navigate social rituals far beyond their years. Courtiers, visiting dignitaries, and occasionally curious foreign nobles would observe the young heirs with keen interest, noting every minor gesture, mispronunciation, or poorly timed sneeze. One imagines a toddler bowing stiffly, attempting to hide a cough, while visiting ambassador notes silently in his journal. The boy lacks finesse, completely unaware that his own attire smells faintly of stale musk and overcooked cabbage. As we drift onward, it's impossible to ignore the psychological toll. Isolation, high expectations, and a constant undercurrent of potential danger created a unique childhood experience. Some children developed remarkable resilience and wit, quietly absorbing the absurdities of royal life with a mild, bemused stoicism. Others, predictably, became temperamental, nervous, or prone to dramatic flourishes that could unsettle even the most seasoned courtiers. It's easy, from a distance of several centuries, to imagine these children quietly plotting small acts of rebellion, pulling wigs, spilling tea, or politely refusing to memorize yet another line of Latin. And yet, despite the constant perils, there were small moments of genuine joy. Occasional games, fleeting friendships with siblings or other children, and the rare indulgence in a sugary treat or stolen fruit could bring brief delight. Even amidst powdered wigs, lead-based cosmetics, and endless lessons, royal children found ways to experience the world with a combination of curiosity and mild exasperation. Perhaps it was these small joys that helped them endure the broader rigors of their fragile, heavily supervised existences. Before we drift onward into the strange culinary habits and hygiene rituals that accompanied these delicate childhoods, take a moment to imagine yourself in such a nursery, ornate, scented, and slightly hazardous. Would you have thrived under the strict supervision, or quietly plotted escape to a life of mud, fresh air, and simple pleasures? Reflect on this gently, as you adjust your blanket or take a slow breath, and let yourself drift with the thought of ancient, sugar-laden, courtly lives. What would you have done as a royal child, endlessly watched, taught, and occasionally poisoned by well-meaning physicians? Tell me in the comments, softly, of course. Welcome back, everyone. Let's drift gently from the world of fragile, powdered childhoods into another realm equally delicate, equally perilous: royal diets and hygiene. Imagine a time when what you ate, how you washed, and whether your shoes were polished would determine not just your comfort but your survival, or, at the very least, your social standing. So, settle a little deeper into your pillow. Perhaps tug the blanket up over your shoulders, and let's wander through dining halls, kitchens, and bath chambers of the past. Royal diets were often astonishingly ambitious. Meals were not simply food, they were statements. A king or queen might dine on multiple courses, featuring meats from every corner of their realm, exotic spices imported at vast expense, and sweets so sugary they could melt teeth at a polite distance. Naturally, such culinary extravagance came with risks. Food preservation was unreliable. Spoiled meat, improperly stored fish, or overripe fruits could result in mild to severe illness. Yet, aristocrats seemed to accept this as part of the lifestyle. After all, who wouldn't gamble their digestive health for a roast swan garnished with gold leaf? Breakfasts, when they occurred, were understated compared to lunches and dinners, if one can call royal mornings understated. Often, a simple bread and honey affair would precede the ritualized feast, but even that simple meal was layered with potential mishap. Bread could harbor mold. Honey, while sweet and luxurious, occasionally contained traces of fermentation. A royal child with a delicate constitution might begin the day in a haze of stomach discomfort, punctuated by gentle groans, sighs, or the quiet notes of a chamber musician attempting to maintain decorum. Lunchtime in royal courts was an elaborate affair. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes that were as visually impressive as they were biologically questionable. Poultry stuffed with other poultry, pies containing every conceivable meat, and sauces thick with heavy cream or exotic spices were common. Courtiers ate carefully, often with gloved hands or delicate utensils, while subtly observing one another. A misstep, perhaps a small slip of gravy or a minor burp, could result in mild embarrassment. One imagines a nervous glance of a young prince, desperately trying to conceal the effects of overindulgence, while the queen, elegantly powdered, offers a faintly disapproving smile. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, was closely tied to diet. Royal baths were infrequent, in part due to superstition, and in part due to the practical difficulties of heating enormous quantities of water. Instead, people relied on scented oils, powders, and occasional sponge baths. The combination of rich foods, heavy perfumes, and infrequent washing created a sensory environment that was, to modern noses, somewhat challenging. Visitors might describe the air as dense, aromatic, or, in polite whispers, mildly overwhelming. Yet within this haze of scents, social life continued, with polite conversation, subtle judging, and a quiet endurance of olfactory assault. Royal kitchens were another fascinating realm. Chefs were highly trained, often inventive, and occasionally a bit reckless. They experimented with flavors, textures, and even colorings that would horrify a modern food safety inspector. Jellies made from boiling animal parts, sugar sculptures, and pastries glazed with questionable substances were common. And while these creations were meant to impress, they could also produce mild digestive disasters, fainting spells, or quiet muttering among guests. One could imagine a foreign ambassador politely nibbling a candied pheasant while silently wondering if the elegant dish might also be mildly toxic. Children were not exempt from dietary eccentricities. Royal diets for young princes and princesses often mirrored adult indulgence, albeit in reduced quantities. Sugar, honey, and spice breads were common, sometimes combined with broths that were medicinal rather than tasty. If a young royal protested, the answer was rarely sympathy. Instead, gentle insistence, or, in some cases, the intervention of a stern tutor, ensured compliance. One can almost see the tiny hands reaching for forbidden sweets, while a wet nurse whispers, "Patience, child. It's for your constitution." Fully aware that constitution was code for "we're slightly worried about your ability to survive the next fortnight." Table manners were rigorously enforced, though the rules could be strained by modern standards. Courtiers were expected to eat quietly, use the correct utensils for each dish, and maintain proper posture, while enduring a constant threat of spilled gravy, overripe fruit, or accidentally brushing against a powdered wig. Children were particularly at risk. One slip, one sneeze, one minor faux pas could earn a polite correction from a teacher, or a slightly scandalized glance from a visiting noble. This combination of vigilance and fragility made mealtimes both ceremonial and mildly terrifying. Let's drift to hygiene practices associated with food consumption. Royal households often employed vast numbers of servants to ensure that dishes were polished, hands were clean, and crumbs did not accumulate in inappropriate places. Yet, despite these precautions, contamination was inevitable. Flies, rodents, and occasional mold were standard companions in kitchens and dining halls alike. Royals rarely seemed fazed, perhaps because they had grown accustomed to these hazards from birth. One imagines a young prince or princess observing a small mouse scurry beneath the table with a mixture of horror and mild amusement, quietly wondering if the dish they were about to taste had been touched by tiny paws. Drinking habits were similarly elaborate. Wine, ale, and occasionally distilled spirits were common at meals, even for minors, because water quality was unreliable. Children were sometimes given watered-down wine, protect them from disease, which seems an odd kind of protection, but in the context of medieval epidemiology, it made perfect sense. Adults indulge in full-strength beverages with careful attention to etiquette, all while maintaining a calm exterior. One misstep could result in a spill, a mild argument, or an awkward glance, hardly catastrophic, but slightly exhausting. Beyond everyday meals, royal banquets presented another level of complexity. These were not simply dinners. They were performances. Tables were arranged with astonishing symmetry. Dishes were presented with ceremonial precision, and entertainers often accompanied meals to maintain morale and distract guests from minor gastronomic hazards. Courtiers would applaud politely, perhaps sniff discreetly, and attempt to maintain a composed expression while navigating unfamiliar foods. A single poorly chewed bite or inadvertent cough could invite polite commentary or a quietly stifled laugh, creating a slow, rolling tension beneath the surface of the seemingly serene banquet. Royal diets also reflected medical theories of the time, which were ambitious, to say the least. Physicians prescribed foods to balance humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, believing that culinary choices could influence temperament, health, and sometimes moral character. A child suffering from melancholy might be offered sweetened meats, while one with mild fever might receive spiced wine. The logic was internally consistent, though occasionally lethal. We can imagine the careful calculation required to ensure that a prince's stomach remained balanced while avoiding overindulgence or mild poisoning. And then, of course, there were the unfortunate experiments. Royal children sometimes became unwitting guinea pigs for new recipes, medicinal diets, or extravagant desserts. A custard infused with saffron might produce delight, or perhaps a mild stomach ache. A meat pie prepared in an innovative style might impress the queen, or quietly make the young prince regret his choice of breakfast. Historians often describe these episodes with gentle understatement. But one can imagine the mild chaos behind closed doors, a child squirming, a wet nurse murmuring reassurances, and a tutor trying to maintain the appearance of calm and composure. Let's not forget personal hygiene, which was often a separate, equally hazardous endeavor. Bathing, while occasionally encouraged, was far from routine. Many royals relied on scented waters, sponges, or damp cloths. The combination of food residues, heavy powders, and infrequent bathing could create a lingering scent, which, in turn, prompted the liberal use of perfumes, scented gloves, and powdered wigs. One imagines a royal procession where every movement subtly releases a cloud of fragrance, masking the underlying reality. Visitors, of course, were expected to tolerate this without comment, though polite grimaces were sometimes unavoidable. Even dental care was rudimentary, despite the wealth and ambition of royal households. Children and adults alike suffer from tooth decay, infections, and occasional loss of teeth, often exacerbated by sugary diets. Treatments were, predictably, medieval in nature: poultices, extraction without anesthesia, and mysterious tonics that promise relief. A child might endure a dental procedure with stoic silence, only to return to lessons immediately afterward, all while wondering if this was a usual course of noble existence. In summary, royal diets and hygiene were a curious mix of extravagance and hazard. Meals were designed to impress, protect, and occasionally harm. Baths were infrequent. Powders were omnipresent, and delicate constitutions were constantly tested by food, odor, and mild social peril. And yet, life continued, slowly, gracefully, and with just enough discomfort to keep the royal family aware of their mortality, and perhaps, occasionally, their humility. Before we drift onward to the fascinating world of cosmetics, wigs, and facial powders, take a slow, deep breath and consider. Could you have survived a royal banquet with its sugar-laden meats, spiced wines, and perfumed air without quietly wishing for a modest loaf of bread and a glass of clean water? Reflect gently, and if the thought makes you smile, softly whisper to yourself, would you have lasted a day in a royal kitchen, surrounded by exotic foods, overpowering perfumes, and strict manners? Tell me in the comments, quietly of course. Now that we've gently wandered through royal diets and hygiene mishaps, let's drift into another fascinating and slightly alarming domain: cosmetics and hair rituals. Imagine a court where beauty was not merely a preference, but performance, a duty, and occasionally a minor form of self-harm. Settle further into your pillow, perhaps wrap the blanket a little tighter around your shoulders, and let's quietly explore the delicate art of looking impeccable at any cost. Cosmetics in early modern Europe were, to modern eyes, a curious mixture of artistry, obsession, and occasional toxicity. Lead-based powders were highly prized for achieving the coveted pale complexion, the signal that one was too wealthy to work outdoors. One imagines a duchess delicately applying white paste to her cheeks, smiling faintly in the mirror, all the while unaware, or perhaps only mildly aware, of the subtle toll taking hold in her organs. Faint headaches, mild nausea, and eventual skin damage were considered acceptable collateral in the pursuit of courtly perfection. Naturally, vanity trumped caution. Wigs were another marvel of aristocratic ambition. Large, powdered, and elaborately curled, they were status symbols, conversation pieces, and mild hazards all at once. Some wigs could weigh several pounds, making nodding, bowing, and simple mobility a subtle endurance test. Courtiers and visitors were expected to navigate these forests of powdered hair with care, lest an errant gesture disturb the carefully balanced structure, creating mild embarrassment and the occasional fainting fit. One can almost hear the small sigh of relief as a noble woman adjusts her towering coiffure, knowing she survived another half hour without catastrophe. Makeup was not limited to powders. Rouge, lip stains, and even eyebrow dyes were applied with precision and, occasionally, with substances that would make a modern chemist nervous. Venetian red, made from toxic mercury compounds, was applied to cheeks with the aim of achieving a healthy glow. The irony, of course, is that the resulting complexion could be brilliant in candlelight, yet steadily damaging in reality. One might imagine a young courtier politely complimenting a duchess on her radiant cheeks, unaware that the glow was slowly corroding the very skin beneath their admiration. Perfumes, which we touched on earlier, were integral to cosmetics. Scented oils were applied to the face, neck, and hands, sometimes mixed with powders or creams, creating a multi-layered olfactory experience. The goal, naturally, was sophistication, refinement, and a certain social dominance. The unintended consequence was often an overwhelming cloud of aroma, capable of eliciting mild headaches, fainting, or polite coughing among nearby observers. Visitors learned to tread carefully, moving slowly and inhaling shallowly, lest they succumb to the subtle power of combined fragrance and toxicity. Let's drift over to the realm of personal hair care beyond wigs. Royal men and women alike devoted hours to brushing, curling, and perfuming their hair. Pomades and oils were popular, sometimes mixed with extract from herbs, flowers, or animal fats. The effect was shiny, stylized hair, but the reality included greasy textures, unpleasant odors, and in some cases, scalp infections. One can imagine a young page gently attempting to braid a princess's hair, while secretly wondering if they should carry a fainting couch nearby. Even more ambitious was the use of hair powder. White powders, scented with lavender or rose, were applied liberally to both men and women, creating a look of courtly elegance. The downside was clouded vision, sneezing fits, and the risk of inhaling potentially toxic substances. Despite these minor hazards, powdered hair became synonymous with social status, a visual shorthand that said, softly but unmistakably, I am important, I am refined, and I am slightly endangered by my own beauty regimen. Facial hair was similarly curated for men of the court. Beards were trimmed meticulously, often styled with oils, powders, and scented pomades. This was both a fashion statement and a subtle indicator of masculinity and status. The process could be lengthy, mildly dangerous if sharp tools were involved, and occasionally infuriating if the barber applied too much powder or accidentally nicked the delicate skin of a young duke's jaw. Imagine the polite grimace, the soft murmur of discomfort, and the eventual triumphant smile once the reflection in the mirror met expectations. Makeup rituals extended to special events, when the stakes were slightly higher. Court balls, state dinners, and ceremonial appearances required full attention to detail. Every cheek, lip, and hair strand had to be precise. Guests would approach, bow, and comment with gentle admiration, while simultaneously navigating the subtle perils of overpowering fragrance, sticky powders, and sometimes faint chemical irritations. It was a delicate dance, practiced over years, perfected by repetition, and occasionally abandoned entirely due to mild disaster. Children, of course, were not exempt. Young princes and princesses might be introduced to mild cosmetic rituals at an early age, ostensibly to cultivate poise and grace. The reality was often confusion, sneezing, and occasionally tears. Wet nurses, tutors, and governesses oversaw these routines, balancing encouragement with a subtle thread of polite reprimand. One can almost hear a small voice muttering under a powder-coated breath, "Why must I endure this for the sake of appearance?" And yet, compliance was expected, as always, in the grand tradition of aristocratic obedience. A particular curiosity arises when we examine the intersection of cosmetics and health. Some remedies, intended to improve appearance, were ironically destructive. Lead creams promised flawless skin, while simultaneously eroding it. Rouge made from cinnabar created a fashionable glow, while subtly poisoning the cheeks. And yet, these practices persisted for centuries. One can imagine a queen softly inhaling the fumes of her own powders, reflecting quietly on the paradox of beauty and fragility, a gentle sigh escaping lips stained with mercury-based rouge. Royal cosmetics were also a tool of political performance. Appearance signaled power, stability, and social rank. A misapplied powder, a smudge of rouge, or a drooping wig could provoke polite whispers, slightly stifled laughter, or subtle envy. Courtiers learned to navigate these visual cues with care, recognizing that in royal society, elegance could be both a shield and a mild hazard. One imagines diplomats practicing small bows while carefully avoiding scented clouds, navigating courtly dangers as surely as they navigated treaties. Let's drift for a moment to the personal discomforts of daily beauty rituals. Baths were infrequent, powders were pervasive, and wigs were heavy. Children endured early lessons in the delicate balance of appearance and endurance. Young princes and princesses were taught to sit still, smile gently, and allow powders, oils, and wigs to perform their magic. One can almost see a tiny hand pressing a damp cloth to a flushed cheek, whispering a soft promise to survive another hour in the service of appearance. Evening routines were a continuation of the day's delicate endurance. Powdered wigs were removed carefully, face creams or scented oils applied, and perfumes refreshed. Courtiers moved quietly through corridors, mindful of scent posture and the slightest misstep. The goal was subtle: maintain social status, avoid mild embarrassment, and survive until the next ceremonial appearance. And somehow, despite the hazards, despite the faint dizziness induced by fragrances, and despite the slow accumulation of minor toxins, life continued, gracefully and with mild amusement. Before we drift onward to the next topic, consider this gently. Could you have endured daily beauty rituals that were equal parts artistry, hazard, and mild self-poisoning? Would you have sighed politely or quietly plotted a life without powders and perfumes? Reflect softly, and perhaps whisper your answer to the universe. Could you have survived the day in courtly beauty rituals without fainting or muttering under your breath? Tell me in the comments. Gently, of course. As we drift onward, let's gently wander into royal leisure. For aristocrats, relaxation was rarely simple. Free time was filled with activities that were elegant, absurd, and occasionally hazardous. So, adjust your blanket, take a slow breath, and picture a sunlit courtyard, a palace gallery, or a perfumed hall, where princes and princesses engage in pursuits that might amuse, alarm, or quietly frustrate. Hunting was a favorite pastime, particularly for kings and young princes. Imagine a cold dawn, a heavily powdered nobleman mounted on an oversized horse, spear in hand, chasing deer through frosted woods. It was physically demanding, occasionally dangerous, and socially significant. Success brought admiration. Failure invited polite commentary and discreet laughter. Young royals learned early that leisure was not merely amusement, but a subtle test of skill, endurance, and temperament. Games were another form of entertainment. Chess, backgammon, and card games were popular, though played with formality and seriousness that could exhaust the uninitiated. Children were expected to learn the rules quickly, strategize carefully, and maintain decorum. A single slip, a miscounted move, or an ill-timed laugh could result in mild reprimand or gentle correction. One can almost hear the sigh of a young prince, strategically plotting his next move while secretly wishing for a simpler game of catch or tag. Music and dance filled halls with quiet energy. Courtiers practiced instruments for hours, sometimes to the delight of the royal ear, sometimes to polite dismay. Dance lessons were equally meticulous. Every step, turn, and bow required precision. Children, often dressed in restrictive clothing, practiced tirelessly, their patience tested by the dual demands of physical exertion and social grace. One imagines a small prince tripping over a hem, gracefully recovering, and offering a polite bow as though nothing untoward had occurred. Collections were another subtle form of leisure. Royals accumulated books, paintings, coins, and curiosities from across the realm. Some of these collections were meticulously organized. Others reflected a whimsical, eccentric taste. Curiosity cabinets, filled with bones, shells, and exotic objects, sometimes startled visitors. Imagine a young princess tiptoeing around a display of skulls and preserved insects. Try to avoid embarrassing squeals while pretending to appreciate the artistic merit of the items. Travel was a form of leisure that doubled as political performance. Royal journeys required careful planning, elaborate carriages, and, naturally, considerable attention to appearance. Every step, every pause, and every greeting was scrutinized. Young royals experienced the slow rhythm of travel, observing landscapes, people, and the subtle hazards of courtly hospitality. One might gently imagine a prince quietly sighing as his powdered wig becomes slightly askew, or a princess adjusting her gloves to hide faint traces of exhaustion. Animals played a peculiar role in leisure. Exotic pets, hunting dog, and falcons were common companions. Caring for them required attention, patience, and sometimes a mild tolerance for chaos. One can picture a courtier quietly rescuing a mischievous monkey from the queen's powdered skirts, or a prince gently scolding a falcon that had become slightly too interested in ceremonial decorations. These interactions, delicate and amusing, provided subtle relief from the relentless structure of court life. Royal hobbies could also be dangerous. Fencing, jousting, and archery provided physical exercise and entertainment, but they carried the risk of injury, embarrassment, or fainting. Courtiers observed with mild anxiety, ready to offer assistance or polite commentary. One imagines a young duke, slightly flushed and mildly bruised, practicing his swordsmanship under the watchful eyes of tutors, guards, and slightly concerned relatives. Before we drift further, it's worth noting the psychological rhythm of leisure. Even in moments of recreation, royals were subtly conditioned to maintain composure, elegance, and social awareness. Laughter was permitted, but carefully measured. Frustration was tolerated only to the extent it could be hidden behind a polite smile. And yet, despite these constraints, small joys persisted. A successful game, a gentle prank, or a quiet moment in a sunlit garden. Engagement gently. If you were a royal child with endless games, hunting, and mildly terrifying hobbies, which would you have enjoyed and which would have driven you to quietly plot escape? Let me know in the comments. As we drift onward from playful hobbies and mild catastrophes, let's quietly examine royal fashion, an arena where elegance and danger were strangely intertwined. Imagine fabrics heavy enough to tire a small child, collars sharp enough to produce discomfort, and shoes that threaten minor sprains at every step. Adjust your blanket, inhale slowly, and picture a hall filled with silk, velvet, and gentle sighs of the slightly overdressed. Court fashion was as much about status as appearance. Large ruffs, flowing gowns, and layered petticoats were visually impressive, but physically demanding. Walking gracefully while layered in fabric, powdered, and perhaps slightly ill from dinner was an endurance sport. Young princes and princesses learned early to maintain poise despite restrictive clothing, awkward hems, and occasionally scorching hot chambers, because royalty demanded composure above comfort. Shoes, in particular, were a quiet hazard. Slippery floors combined with stiff heels, long trains, or delicate slippers created a subtle risk of falls. Courtiers learned to watch their step, moving in carefully choreographed paths to avoid minor embarrassment or injury. One can imagine a young duchess quietly tiptoeing, holding her skirts with polite precision, as a page scurries behind to ensure she does not stumble in front of visiting dignitaries. Fashion also imposed social rules. Certain colors, fabrics, and embellishments were reserved for royalty, while others were forbidden to anyone of lesser rank. Mistakes in dress could provoke polite judgment or subtle whispers. Children, naturally, were keenly observed for missteps. A slightly wrinkled sleeve, a misaligned ribbon, or a faint stain could draw attention and mild rebuke. Imagine a tiny prince standing at attention, attempting to smooth his cuffs while quietly wishing for plain trousers and soft shoes. Accessories carried subtle hazards as well. Fans, gloves, hats, and jewelry were not just decorative. They were also cumbersome, occasionally hazardous, and often laden with symbolic meaning. A dropped fan, a tilted hat, or a clinking necklace could produce a polite murmur or barely concealed amusement. One imagines a courtier quietly adjusting a chain around a young duke's neck, ensuring that no misstep disrupts the flow of courtly appearance. Gowns and robes themselves could be hazardous. Heavy fabrics, combined with layers of petticoats and undergarments, sometimes produced overheating. Courtiers sweated quietly. Fans fluttered in gentle desperation, and children learned endurance early. The result was a careful balance of elegance, patience, and mild discomfort, all orchestrated to maintain a visual standard that impressed visitors and reinforced social hierarchy. Hats and wigs, already mentioned in previous parts, were also part of fashion's delicate hazards. Large, powdered wigs required careful handling. A misaligned curl or uneven powdering could provoke polite, whispered commentary. Hats, especially for children, were stiff, heavy, and occasionally obstructive. One can imagine a young prince leaning forward carefully to avoid tilting his hat, while a tutor observes quietly, ready to intervene at the slightest misstep. One particular curiosity of fashion was the emphasis on posture. Courtiers were trained to hold themselves precisely, shoulders back, chin level, hands delicately positioned. For children, this was a constant challenge, especially when combined with heavy garments, uncomfortable shoes, or desire to reach a treat or toy. Parents and tutors emphasized posture as a measure of character and social aptitude, a subtle training in endurance and patience, punctuated by gentle sighs and minor complaints. Fabrics themselves carried risks. Silks, velvets, and fine linens were delicate, prone to tearing, and often treated with chemicals or dyes that could irritate skin. A child wearing a gown of delicate silk might experience minor rashes, itching, or mild discomfort. Courtiers, trained in subtlety, would observe politely, perhaps suggesting minor adjustments while maintaining decorum. The combination of sensory discomfort and social expectation created a slowly building tension, though rarely explosive, perfectly suited for our slow, drowsy exploration. Even ceremonial attire could be hazardous. Crowns, scepters, ceremonial robes, and medals were worn during events with strict rules. A poorly adjusted crown could slip, a robe could snag, and one misstep could produce mild embarrassment. Yet these hazards were endured quietly, with politeness and gentle stoicism. One can imagine a young prince carefully placing a crown atop his head, resisting the urge to tilt it slightly for comfort, while the court watches with polite anticipation. Leisure activities occasionally intersected with fashion in awkward ways. Hunting in heavy garments, dancing in cumbersome shoes, or navigating palace corridors in long trains demanded patience, skill, and endurance. Young royals quickly learned that elegance and minor personal discomfort were inseparable companions. One might imagine the faint sigh of a princess as she glides past a window, aware that misstep in attire can invite polite whispers from well-dressed courtiers. Before we drift onward to the more complicated domain of court politics and social intrigue, take a gentle moment to consider your own comfort. Could you survive in layers of silk and velvet, stiff shoes, and powdered wigs while maintaining perfect poise for hours on end? would you have endured, or quietly wish for a simpler life of comfortable clothing and fresh air? Reflect softly and let your imagination wander through these scented, layered, and slightly perilous halls. White heavy checkmarked engagement line. Could you have survived a day in royal fashion, with heavy gowns, stiff shoes, and delicate posture? Tell me in the comments, gently of course. Continuing our slow journey, let's drift into the delicate and sometimes absurd world of court politics. Royals were never merely rulers. They were actors in a stage play of subtle influence, gentle manipulation, and quiet embarrassment. So, nestle further into your pillow, adjust your blanket, and imagine a hall filled with whispered conversations, polite bows, and the faint aroma of perfumes we explored earlier. Court life was a carefully orchestrated dance of hierarchy and influence. Nobles maneuvered subtly, offering compliments, discreet critiques, or carefully timed gifts. Children observed this quietly, learning early the art of patience and subtlety. A young prince might note the slight stiffening of a courtier's back when a new advisor entered, or the polite lowering of eyes when a queen spoke. These observations, though subtle, formed the foundation of political awareness and gentle social cunning. Ceremonial events were particularly fraught. Every bow, every curtsy, every exchange of glances carried meaning. Missteps, slightly too enthusiastic a bow, a misgreeting, a faint cough at the wrong moment, could produce mild embarrassment or subtle social consequences. Young royals learned quickly that precision in appearance, posture, and expression was as important as wisdom or courage. Influence was often quiet rather than overt. Advisors whispered behind curtains, courtiers exchanged gentle glances, and alliances formed slowly. Children, naturally, absorbed these lessons, often attempting small acts of diplomacy among siblings or fellow young nobles. One can imagine a prince carefully negotiating the location of favorite chair, mirroring the adult dynamics of influence with charmingly miniature subtlety. Gossip, of course, was a constant companion. Whispered rumors, polite exaggerations, and careful misdirection shaped perceptions. Royals learned that knowledge of social dynamics was as vital as knowledge of geography, history, or foreign affairs. Even a small faux pas, like laughing too loudly or mispronouncing a guest's name, could reverberate quietly through courtly channels. One imagines a mild tension of young royals absorbing these lessons, quietly practicing their polite expressions in mirrors. Ceremonial embarrassment often intersected with fashion, leisure, and etiquette. A tripping child, a misaligned crown, or a slightly stained gown could produce polite whispers or restrained amusement. Royals endured these minor indignities gracefully, though sometimes with an inward sigh. Visitors observed, admired, and occasionally misjudged, unaware of the subtle layers of preparation, endurance, and minor hazard that underpinned every polished gesture. Strategic marriages were another facet of courtly politics. Children were betrothed young, often based on alliances rather than affection. These arrangements carried social, political, and personal consequences, though young royals sometimes regarded them with bemused attachment. One can imagine a princess quietly reflecting on her future spouse while adjusting a heavy gown, wondering if a life of carefully measured conversations and courtly strategy would suit her temperament. Power dynamics extended even to leisure. Hunting grounds, musical performances, and games were subtly infused with political significance. Success or failure in these activities could influence perception, subtly shifting favor or mild disfavor. Children absorbed this fluidity, learning to navigate complex social expectations while enduring physical exertion, ceremonial obligations, and the occasional embarrassment. Before we drift onward to dynastic inbreeding and fragile royal bloodlines, reflect gently. Could you have survived courtly life, where every gesture, smile, and bow carried subtle consequence? Would you have mastered these delicate arts, or quietly preferred a life of simpler pleasures, far from polished halls and scented air? How would you have fared in courtly politics, with whispers, bows, and ceremonial expectations? Tell me in the comments, gently. Now that we've gently navigated courtly intrigue, let's drift into a quieter, yet strangely melancholic realm, royal bloodlines. Imagine long corridors lined with portraits of ancestors, each carefully preserving the family face and the occasional unfortunate genetic predisposition. Settle back, adjust your blanket, and picture generations quietly intermarrying in pursuit of dynastic purity, often with consequences that were obvious only in hindsight. European royalty, in particular, engaged in marriages that prioritized bloodlines over compatibility. Cousins, uncles, and distant relatives were chosen carefully, ostensibly to consolidate power, territory, and influence. The results, softly put, were mixed. Some offspring emerged healthy and brilliant, others fragile and mildly afflicted. The courts treated this with gentle resignation. It was, after all, a risk inherent in the pursuit of perfection. The Habsburg jaw is perhaps the most famous consequence. Generations of intermarriage produce a distinctive facial structure, and along with it, a host of health problems, difficulty chewing, dental issues, and neurological complications. One can almost see a young prince, politely smiling at a visiting dignitary, while quietly struggling with the mechanics of his own jaw. Courtiers whispered politely. Physicians experimented quietly, and life quietly trudged onward. Inbreeding also amplified susceptibility to disease. Frail constitutions, delicate immune systems, and subtle physical deformities were often noted in court diaries. Royals endured with the same stoic grace we've been exploring throughout this journey. Children adapted to limited mobility, mild disabilities, and occasional illness, often under the careful eye of tutors, wet nurses, and doctors whose remedies were charmingly ineffective. Despite these challenges, appearances were paramount. Portraits depicted elegance, vigor, and composure, regardless of actual health. The contrast between visual representation and reality created a quiet irony. Visitors admired the regal pose, unaware that the subject might be recovering from a mild fever, struggling with fragile limb, or enduring subtle neurological complications from generations of intermarriage. Some dynasties took precautionary measures. Marriages were occasionally arranged outside immediate family, though always with an eye toward political gain. Young royals were sometimes paired with distant cousins, noble houses from neighboring lands, or carefully vetted outsiders. Yet, the pressure to maintain dynastic continuity often outweighed personal health considerations. One could imagine a quietly reluctant prince, staring at a formal portrait of his intended spouse, wondering how much charm or survival instinct he might need to navigate the next decade. If you were a prince or princess in a fragile dynasty, knowing your health might reflect generations of cautious intermarriage, would you have accepted your fate or quietly wished for simpler alliances? Share your thoughts in the comments, softly. As we drift from fragile dynasties, let's float into the quieter, but emotionally rich world of sibling rivalry and minor courtly grudges. Royals, like everyone else, squabbled, envied, and occasionally plotted subtle revenge, albeit with a near politeness. Imagine children raised in gilded rooms, each aware of inheritance, precedence, and the slightest advantage in protocol. Sibling rivalries were a daily occurrence. A slightly favored child might receive an extra treat, a better seat, or a subtle compliment, prompting mild jealousy in brothers or sisters. Games turned into contests, lessons into subtle battles, and minor achievements became quiet competitions. One can imagine two princes vying for queen's approval, each politely praising the other's accomplishments while inwardly planning small acts of defiance. Courtiers observed these dynamics with a mixture of mild concern and quiet amusement. Diaries often recorded subtle pranks, minor disputes over gifts, and whispered arguments. These minor conflicts provided a gentle rhythm to life at court, a blend of humor, tension, and endurance. Young royals learned patience, strategy, and how to survive the quiet, ongoing negotiation of family dynamics. Sometimes these rivalries escalated to more visible incidents. Clothing was stolen, pets were commandeered, or minor accidents were orchestrated. The goal was rarely malicious. Instead, it was a slow, polite assertion of agency within a tightly controlled environment. One can picture a princess quietly withdrawing a small doll, smiling politely, while her sibling plans a subtle countermeasure. Could you have survived a childhood filled with subtle rivalries and carefully orchestrated pranks from your siblings? Tell me in the comments, softly. As we drift onward, let's consider royal marriages, the blend of political strategy, occasional romance, and frequent absurdity. Royals rarely married for love. Instead, they united houses, consolidated power, and sometimes created gentle chaos. Children betrothed early often grew into adults who had to navigate affection, duty, and public perception simultaneously. Marriages were rarely smooth. Misunderstandings, language barriers, cultural differences, and personal quirks combined to produce a quiet comedy of errors. One might imagine a young queen politely curtsying, while inwardly puzzling over her new husband's eccentric habits, which range from bizarre dietary preferences to mild obsession with courtly rituals. Courtiers observed these interactions with polite fascination, offering subtle advice or quietly stifled laughter. The domestic environment was equally controlled. Private quarters, servants, and rigid schedules created a highly structured life. Yet, within this structure, minor disasters occurred daily. Spilled wine, misplaced documents, and mild disagreements over seating arrangements or ceremonial precedents. These minor irritations were endured quietly, with patience, grace, and occasional gentle sarcasm. If you were married for politics rather than love, how would you have endured domestic absurdities and minor daily disasters? Share softly in the comments. Now let's drift into the world of fads, fashion, and aristocratic obsessions. Royals were often trendsetters, influencing everything from powdered wigs to exotic pets. These trends were sometimes harmless, sometimes mildly dangerous, and always slightly absurd. Exotic animals were a particular fascination. Monkeys, birds, and small cats provided amusement but also created hazards. Scratched furniture, stolen trinkets, and occasional minor illness. One can imagine a prince gently trying to retrieve a runaway parrot, while a tutor observes with mild exasperation. Other fads included elaborate games, new dance styles, and peculiar food trends. Royals would adopt these enthusiastically, sometimes ignoring minor discomforts, health risks, or social consequences. A young princess might practice a complex dance in restrictive clothing, enduring blisters and faint dizziness, all while maintaining perfect composure for an audience of courtiers. Which royal fad or trend would you have secretly loved or quietly hated? Tell me softly in the comments. As we drift toward the final moments of our journey, let's quietly reflect on the lives we've observed. Fragile children, powdered faces, heavy gowns, senate halls, subtle intrigues, and dynasties stretched thin by generations of careful intermarriage. Life for royalty was rarely simple, often absurd, occasionally perilous, but always layered with human quirks, gentle humor, and endurance. As you settle into your blanket and take a slow, calming breath, consider the strange combination of beauty, fragility, and mild chaos that shaped these lives. Would you have thrived, survived, or quietly plotted a simpler existence? Perhaps a touch of all three. Before we part, let's gently close with some housekeeping. If you enjoyed drifting through these centuries with me, consider liking, subscribing, and softly sharing this journey with others who appreciate slow, sleepy history. A comment is always welcome, gently reflecting your thoughts on royal life, absurd fashions, or mischievous siblings. And finally, as you prepare to drift off to sleep, imagine a palace at night, corridors quiet, perfumes fading, candles extinguished, and children finally resting after another day of powdered chaos. Take a deep breath, settle softly, and know that you have quietly survived a day in royal history, without powdered wigs, mercury rouge, or stiff shoes. Good night. And if a royal dream visits you, may it be as mildly amusing and gently absurd as the lives we've explored together. Which part of royal life surprised or amused you the most? Share your reflections quietly in the comments, and gently drift off knowing history can be both fascinating and sleepy.